What if I told you? The collapse of an empire never begins with explosions. It begins with silence. Numbers on a screen, shifting like sand beneath your feet. As you sit here, the US dollar, once the world's most untouchable currency, is bleeding quietly. The cracks don't roar, they whisper. Debt ceilings stretched beyond comprehension. Banks stitching wounds with digital bandages. And somewhere, in smoke-filled rooms, decisions are made that will never reach your news feed until it's too late. The empire doesn't fall because the people shout. It falls because the world stops listening. Nations that once bowed to the dollar are now trading in other tongues. Yuan, ruble, real. Deals are struck in midnight phone calls between Beijing, Moscow, and Riyadh, far from the glowing screens of Wall Street. And as the average American scrolls, laughs, posts, the stage is being built for a collapse that will not ask for their permission. Imagine waking up one morning and the money in your bank still looks the same, but buys 30% less. Imagine foreign investors pulling their stakes overnight. Not because they hate America, but because they planned this moment for decades. A financial war waged without bullets, only algorithms and oil shipments rerouted to ports your maps never marked. The world has seen empires fall before: Rome, Britain, the Ottomans. But this time, the empire owns your debt, your paycheck, your retirement fund. And when the first domino falls, it won't just hit the stock market, it will hit your rent, your food, your future. This is not fear-mongering. This is the first sign of a game that has already begun, and someone, somewhere, is counting down the moves until the king topples.
Every collapse has architects. They don't wear masks, and they rarely stand on podiums. They sign papers, shift digits, whisper in halls of power. While most of the world watches politicians argue on television, the real game is played by the bankers, the trade negotiators, and the state-owned corporations operating from behind darkened glass. Look eastward. China has been buying gold like it's oxygen, building a reserve to outlast any storm the US might unleash. Russia, sanctioned, cornered, yet strangely resilient, is weaving its energy pipelines not towards Washington but towards allies in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Saudi Arabia, once America's soil partner, now courts Beijing with a smile and Moscow with a handshake. Each move is a calculated step, not to declare war with bombs, but with balance sheets. And here's the chilling truth. They do not need to fire a single missile to bring the US to its knees. All they need is a fracture of trust, a moment where the world says, we no longer need the dollar. That sentence, whispered in a backroom in Shanghai or whispered in a trade summit in Johannesburg, could trigger the greatest wealth transfer in modern history. But why now? Because they smell weakness. A debt higher than the skies, political division sharp as broken glass, and a generation that spends more than it saves. They're not pushing for collapse, they're waiting for it. And when the cracks widen, they will move their pawns, knights, and queens across the board with precision honed over decades. This is the part they'll never tell you. Collapse isn't chaos. It's choreography. Every panic is planned. Every sell-off has a beer waiting. And when the markets scream and the people cry, the architects quietly collect land, energy, rare earths, even influence over laws that will govern the next century. You might still believe the game is about nations fighting nations, but it's not. It's about networks fighting for dominance, and they've already set their pieces in motion. When an empire stumbles, the vultures do not mourn, they circle. And when the US stumbles, it will not just be a financial event. It will be a power vacuum, a rewriting of the rules men have lived by for a century. The question is not if there will be winners, but who has been preparing to win long before the first domino falls. China, with its Belt and Road Initiative stretched across continents, stands ready to offer its own currency, the digital yuan, as a safe alternative. Every port it owns, every mine it controls in Africa, every satellite agreement it signs is another nail in the coffin of dollar dominance. Russia, with its energy stranglehold, may not replace America, but it will sell gas and oil to nations who no longer fear US sanctions. And then there is India, neutral, patient, expanding quietly, ready to become the broker between East and West when chaos breaks. But don't overlook the silent alliances. BRICS is not just a trade bloc, it's a growing axis of influence, courting nations from South America to the Middle East. Countries tired of being pawns in someone else's game are now rewriting the rule book together. Even Europe, fractured by its own crises, will seize the opportunity to break certain chains, forging its own path in a post-dollar era. The true winners, however, are rarely the nations you can name. They are the hedge funds who short the market while selling you optimism. They are the families who control media narratives and financial flows. Families that have survived every crash because they do not play fair, they play first. When banks collapse, they buy them for pennies. When currencies fall, they are already holding gold. When chaos spreads, they own the companies that rebuild. And you? Where do you stand in this design? Will you be one of the countless who lose their savings overnight, or one of the few who read the moves before they're made? Because make no mistake, the winners of tomorrow are choosing their side today, while most are still arguing about yesterday.
When the dust finally settles, the world does not return to what it was. It becomes something unrecognizable. If the US economy falters and the dollar weakens beyond recovery, your life will not change with a single explosion, but with 1,000 quiet cuts. Savings that once felt secure will erode overnight. Pensions will shrink, and the cost of food, energy, and shelter will rise like a tide you cannot outrun. Nations will reposition their loyalties. Allies who once stood firm beside America may drift toward new power centers. China, the Middle East, or the expanding BRICS alliance. Military reach becomes expensive when money loses its weight, and influence is a currency stronger than gold. For decades, the world relied on the dollar as a stabilizing force. But in this new order, barter will return in a modern mask. Energy for technology, infrastructure for allegiance, resources for silence. The digital realm will tighten its grip. Crises justify control, and in the name of protecting stability, governments may implement measures that track every transaction, every movement of capital. Central bank digital currencies will rise, not as a choice, but as a condition. Privacy will become a luxury only the powerful can afford, and the very tools designed to help the common man recover will become chains to ensure he never rises again. And yet, within this chaos, opportunity whispers. Those who prepared, the ones who turn information into foresight, will find land at a fraction of its value, assets at a fraction of their worth, businesses for sale from desperate hands. Wealth is never destroyed. It is only transferred. The only question is, to whom? This is the world that waits when an empire begins to fall, not with a bang, but with a recalibration of power so profound it rewrites the contracts of nations. The question is not whether change is coming, but whether you will face it as a pawn or as a player. Now, as this shadow unfolds, we turn to the next question. Not who profits if America crashes, but what ancient blueprint is already shaping the collapse of empires today. Every empire believes it is eternal until the echo of its own footsteps begins to haunt its corridors of power. Rome thought its roads would stretch forever. The British Empire believed the sun would never set. And yet, history keeps a ledger, one that never forgets arrogance, overreach, and decay. What if I told you that the same ancient script that ended the empires of the past is being rehearsed today, right before your eyes? The markers are chillingly familiar: a nation that prints more than it produces, wars that cost more than they win, and a culture that celebrates success while its foundations quietly rot. Rome didn't fall in a single night. It crumbled through inflation, political corruption, endless foreign campaigns, and a citizenry numbed by bread and spectacle. Sound familiar? Each collapse follows a rhythm: overspend, overreach, overpromise, then fracture. In 2025, the warning signs whisper like ghosts. The US dollar is still the world's currency, but its rivals gather like wolves at the tree line. China builds alliances with resources, Russia with energy, and BRICS with an alternative vision of trade. Debt climbs like ivy on the walls of a crumbling palace, and distraction reigns while the pillars creak. And yet, this is not just about America. It is about the cycle, the ancient law that says every power will one day serve the feast it once enjoyed. The only question is, will you be at the table or on the menu? This is where the blueprint begins, a code passed through centuries, visible only to those who dare to read between the lines of history.
Every great downfall begins quietly. It is not the roar of cannons that signals the end. It is the whisper of debt, the rust of neglected infrastructure, the slow bleeding of trust between a government and its people. Ancient Rome debased its currency to pay for wars it could no longer afford. The British Empire taxed its colonies until rebellion became cheaper than loyalty. And now, in 2025, new cracks form beneath the modern throne. Inflation is the silent invader. It strips wealth from the hands of the worker while pretending to be growth. Bread becomes dearer, fuel becomes scarce, and yet the promises remain loud. Everything is fine. But the blueprint tells another story. First comes the debt, then the denial, then the distraction. Entertainment swells while education hollows out. Anger is fed crumbs and unity is replaced by factions. Foreign powers always watch the cycle. When an empire weakens, rivals offer loans, trade agreements, or new currencies, not as gifts but as chains. Look at the shifting alliances of today. Nations hoarding gold, creating parallel banking systems, whispering of a world without the dollar as its heartbeat. The collapse is never just internal, it is accelerated by those who profit from the chaos. And here is the darkest line in the blueprint the people rarely notice until it is too late. Bread and games blind them. Cheap credit lulls them. Digital noise deafens them. By the time the pillars crack, they are told to blame one another, left versus right, rich versus poor, while the architects of decline quietly leave through the back door, wealth intact. The mechanics are ancient, but the names are modern. The blueprint doesn't care about your flag. It cares about the math of power, the psychology of distraction, and the economics of decay. Collapse is rarely an accident. It is often engineered, not always by a single villain, but by a network of interests that thrive in shadows. When an empire trembles, someone is always pulling strings, whispering in halls of power, trading futures in closed rooms. And in 2025, those hands are not bound to any flag, they are bound to profit. Consider the merchants of debt, the global financiers who hold the paper on nations. They do not fear collapse, they prepare for it. When currencies fail, they buy land. When markets fall, they acquire industries for pennies. To the common citizen, a crash is disaster. To them, it is a sale. Media plays its role too, though it wears the mask of concern. Fear is broadcasted, then comfort sold back to you at a premium. Invest here, save there, vote this way, hate that one. The chaos is curated, the narrative managed. And while the world debates distractions, the true shifts happen off camera. Then there are the external players, rival states, waiting in the dark like vultures circling a wounded beast. They do not need to fire a bullet, they need only to offer alternatives. A new currency block, a rare earth supply deal, a promise of energy when others freeze. This is how modern war is waged, without a single headline calling it war. And finally, there are the architects within, those who understand that a broken system can be rebuilt stronger, but only after it falls. They cut support beams under the guise of reform, print wealth under the mask of rescue, and smile as the walls shake. Because in the end, collapse is the oldest method of transfer. Wealth, power, control. All move fastest when the ground is breaking. You were never meant to see this pattern. You were meant to blame the neighbor, the politician, the foreigner, the poor, anyone but the hand behind the curtain. When a great power stumbles, the world owes an end. It reorganizes. Collapse is never the final chapter, it is the turning of a page that was already written long before the fall began. And if the US were to crash tomorrow, the pieces are already set for what comes next. It is not chaos they fear. It is uncontrolled chaos. First comes the narrative. No one could have predicted this, they'll say as they roll out their prepackaged plans. Emergency measures, digital currencies, tightened control under the guise of protection. The very forces that fan the flames will present themselves as the fire brigade. It's an old play, the same one used after wars, after crises, after every engineered storm in history. Then comes the consolidation. Broken banks are bought for cents. Companies on their knees are swallowed whole. Ordinary citizens are too busy surviving to notice who is buying their future. A new elite emerges, or rather, the old elite wearing new masks. They shift wealth from paper to assets, from currency to influence. Land. Technology, data. These are the spoils of modern war. Allies turn opportunists. Enemies turn investors. China, Europe, Russia, even Gulf powers, each will carve a slice of what's left. not through invasion, but through contracts, acquisitions, energy deals, and digital dominance. The US will still stand, but it may no longer lead, not in the way it once did. And in this recovery, a new world order begins to take shape. One where freedom is streamlined, where money is programmable, where dissent is expensive. Not by accident, but by design. The blueprint is already drafted. The only question is, will you read it before they build it? They said the American empire would never fall. They said its dollar was uncheckable, its markets untouchable, its alliances eternal. But in the silence of closed-door meetings, far from the cameras, there are hands quietly shifting the balance of power. Imagine this: a single spark, a chain reaction in the stock market, a sudden whisper of war, or a deliberate tightening of global trade. The question isn't if America can crash. The real question is, who would profit if it does? As 2025 unfolds, the world is watching the US economy like a wounded giant. National debt is swelling past unimaginable figures. The Federal Reserve is locked between inflation and collapse, and the political stage is more divided than ever. Every great power that falls leaves behind a feeding frenzy, and history tells us vultures always circle first. China eyes dominance over rare earth minerals and trade routes that power global technology. Russia sees an opportunity in energy markets where chaos means higher control. Gulf states quietly increase their leverage in oil pricing. And European conglomerates, while publicly allied with the US, have contingency plans that shift their capital eastward the moment the dollar shakes. But here's what they don't want you to know. In every financial earthquake, there are those who prepare to gain while others lose everything. Hedge funds bet on collapse. Shadow banks hoard gold. Elite families, the kind whose names never leave secret files, move their pieces before the storm even begins. This isn't just about money. It's about influence. If the US crashes, whoever buys the ruins controls the future. The infrastructure, the debts, the data, the land, even the food systems, everything has a price tag when the empire is weak. And while ordinary citizens argue over politics, borders, and distractions, the real game is being played in currency swaps, offshore holdings, and strategic silence. So before we go deeper, ask yourself this: what if the next crisis isn't an accident at all? What if it's engineered because someone, somewhere, stands to win bigger than you can imagine?
Behind every major crash in history, there are two stories, the one the world is told, and the one whispered in darkened boardrooms, far from the light of public scrutiny. As 2025 tightens its grip, the whispers are growing louder. Banks begin quietly pulling liquidity. Billionaires move their assets offshore. Nations that once begged for US backing now hedge their bets with gold, digital currencies, and silent treaties. Imagine a war room, no windows, just screens, maps of supply chains blinking red, oil routes shifting, cyber grids marked like battlefields. Round the table sit not presidents, but financiers, energy moguls, intelligence veterans. Their goal is not chaos for chaos's sake. It's controlled collapse, because in controlled collapse, the winners choose what survives. China, for instance, isn't waiting for the US to stumble. It is actively weaving a network of trade corridors that bypass the dollar entirely. The Belt and Road Initiative isn't just infrastructure. It's a chokehold. Every new railway in Africa, every port in Asia, threads in a web that grows stronger as America grows distracted. Then there's the rise of digital central bank currencies, tools of surveillance disguised as modernization. If the dollar falls, whoever holds the strongest digital coin writes the new rules of trade. And it's not only states. Powerful hedge funds are betting on both sides, shorting US bonds while quietly buying distressed assets at pennies on the dollar. But here's the most sinister part. Many of the players betting on a US downturn are inside its own system. Corporations too big to fail now have profit models that thrive in volatility. Media networks amplify fear because fear sells. Politicians? They ride the wave, blaming each other while signing deals that outlive their terms. So ask yourself, who benefits from instability? It's never the worker, the saver, the family building a future. It's those who move first, quietly, invisibly. And when the crash comes, they won't be there to save you. They'll be there to own what's left of you. And now, the veil lifts. You've seen the tremors beneath the surface, the quiet sell-offs, the covert alliances, the bets made in the dark. But here is the truth they will never put on the evening news. Collapse isn't always an accident. It is often a harvest. When the US trembles, the world doesn't just watch, it moves. Hedge funds like BlackRock and Vanguard position themselves like vultures over a battlefield, ready to buy distressed real estate, farmland, and technology patents for a fraction of their worth. Institutions like the IMF step in, not as saviors, but as architects of debt dependency, offering relief that locks nations into decades of repayment under their terms. And behind these moves, intelligence arms whisper, not in defense of the people, but in service of the blueprint. Who profits? Those who already hold power. Who pays? The ones told to tighten their belts and trust the system. They call it restructuring, but in reality, it's the redistribution of sovereignty from nations, from individuals, to a handful of entities that treat crisis like currency. Here's the paradox. A collapse in the US may hurt its citizens in the short term, but for certain global players, it's the perfect stage to redraw the map, to introduce new currencies, new trade roles, and even new alliances that were impossible before the chaos. And what about you? You're not supposed to know this. You're meant to scroll past, to drown in noise, to argue left versus right while the board is reset above your head. But now you've heard the patterns, the names, the mechanisms. So ask yourself, are you just watching history unfold, or are you ready to stand outside the narrative? Because the next collapse, whether it's this year or next, won't just change markets, it will change identities. The world after it will belong to those who saw it coming and moved while others froze. This is the final warning. Every great empire collapses not when it is weakest, but when its people believe it's unshakable.